Hello and welcome. I'm Tracey Polowich, host of the Excellence Connection podcast, where we connect our listeners with subject matter experts, knowledge, and resources to help along the excellence journey. Today, my guests are Nancy Weigel and Rick Quail. Both are now retired, but spent their careers in municipal government. Nancy spent her 28-year career working in various positions with the Town of Okotoks, including the Corporate and Strategic Services Director and Deputy CAO, and has done some executive coaching as well. And Rick has held many positions in municipal government and associated entities, including the Chief Administrative Officer for the Town of Okotoks. Welcome to the show, Nancy and Rick.
Thank you.
It's great to have you both. This is the first multiple guest podcast I've done, so it's going to be a new type of format, but I'm looking forward to talking with you in particular, but not only about your experiences with the Town of Okotoks. And before we begin, I'd like to give you each an opportunity to further introduce yourselves and your backgrounds a little bit for our audience. Nancy, do you want to go first?
Sure. So as mentioned, 28 years working with the Town of Okotok. I was the Corporate and Strategic Services Director. I'll explain that a little bit. That held portfolios that were human resources, corporate communications, legislative services, environment and sustainability, and strategic planning. So I was very fortunate to have a very broad overview of the organization, and that is largely where the excellence work came forward and led that for a number of years.
Awesome.
Hello,
and
everybody.
Rick?
Hi. Well, it all started in 1990. It all started. I commenced my career in Northern Ontario. I came to Alberta and worked in the Regional Planning Commission system for nearly a decade before coming down to Okotoks and having the good fortune to help manage the growth of this community from about 4,000 people in 1988 to over 30,000 people as we sit here today. Long-term employees, we're both long-term employees of the town, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that had to do with the challenges, the opportunities, and the collective desire by our many elected officials we work with and our community to strive towards excellence in municipal government.
That's awesome. So while the two of you worked at the Town of Okotoks, you implemented the Canadian Excellence Framework and had some pretty significant success with improving the town's performance and even winning several awards for your efforts. Having gone through this experience, what are the most important activities and initiatives municipal government can undertake towards achieving a culture of excellence and a mindset of continuous improvement, do you think?
Just an introductory comment. I think from a broad perspective, it's never give up and continuously strive for improvement. We actually began this in the late 80s with a program called the Service Cycle Improvement Program, SKIP. And we skipped along with that, and it came and went. And we just continuously work towards developing programs that would help deliver better services for our community and address the concerns that our elected officials had relative to their priorities.
Yeah, thanks for that jog in the memory of the Service Cycle Improvement Program. And so, we had a long history of having a culture that was wanting to continuously improve. And as Rick had mentioned as well, we were growing very rapidly. So we were always looking for a foundation. And how can we find a framework and a model, something to guide us, and something so that we weren't solely coming up with ideas ourselves, but looking at something that was broad, that was a world-class model, that included whether it was public or private, organizational excellence, while there's certainly some very specific differences between public and private, really that model should be the same for all. So we started to get more and more serious about it over the years in looking for something that would help guide us.
That's a really good point, and I'm glad you made that point about because I often hear from municipal government in particular that, well, we're just a bit different than corporate entities, and so we can't follow the same sorts of practices and so on that are common to high performing organizations in that way. But having gone through that yourselves, you do find that there's quite a few similarities, do you?
There's lots of similarities. There's the one that comes to mind that is slightly different would be, as an example, customer service. Now, Okotoks did an annual, triannual, then it became annual household survey. And we did very well, 98.9% typically in customer satisfaction, which I think, goes to show that we were operating a pretty good organization. Now, some would say customer service, right, from a government perspective, is extremely difficult to get good marks on. And it is in some areas. One area, as an example, where we shone in that would have been our community services that are all in recreation and parks. That can be a little bit more difficult than some of the other areas. As an example, when you're collecting a utility or a tax payment, nobody wants to do that. So yes, there's some differences, slightly like that, but there's still pockets where you can do extremely well. And while they may not, from a customer perspective, they may not always like some of the rules around it, there's still about explaining and being kind on from a customer service perspective and implementing the right processes that wouldn't frustrate your customers in those areas.
So along the same lines, then, how practical is it for a municipality to implement best practices or an excellence model to achieve efficiency and effectiveness?
I think it goes back to working with your elected officials on what kind of community you want to build, what kind of relationship you want to have with your citizens, and how responsive you want to be to their wishes, aspirations, and needs. It really boils down to that, and from that comes a desire and willingness to look towards innovative approaches, to think about different ways of delivering services or providing services or getting out of certain types of service business. Mm-hmm. And as a community that went from about 4,000 people in 1988 to plus 30,000, we had many examples where certain businesses you moved out of, for example, the delivery of water and sewer utility services, whereby we contracted those out to a third-party provider, to other services that you brought back within the organization. And subsequently, there have been services that we have, and I know we'll get into this when we talk about regional initiatives, where we've actually taken our service delivery models and we've reached out to other communities within our area to assist them in providing those same services, like solid waste collection.
Yeah, all great examples for sure. There was a lot of change in our organization, and so I guess the comment I want to make too there, I think as Rick said, both your elected officials, most of the time they're pretty proud and excited to work for an organization that can recognize and is working on organizational excellence. But also from employee attraction and retention, that too. That's also very exciting for them. And yes, they're busy and things, like I said, we're moving and changing really rapidly. But we were able to attract a number of employees who could have worked at organizations that were, say, much larger and perhaps even might have paid more than we did, but they wanted to work for us because we had started to gain this reputation of doing a number of things right.
And we also focus very much so, Trace, on things like organizational design and bringing decision-making to the level of impact so that the folks that were involved had the ability to make decisions on the fly within parameters. And that really helped, I think, to empower our employee base.
Yeah, that definitely would. And Nancy, we've spoken previously, and one of the things you mentioned around the practicality was, when you're looking at initiatives to implement with respect to excellence and higher performance, you had given the advice that you want to look for the right size of initiative. So something that's not too insignificant or small, but not also too large or overwhelming. Can you comment about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So again, Excellence Canada, there was a framework there that gave us guidance, but it was really important at different stages of our journey to look for some small wins and also to have those big, hairy, audacious goals as well. So that helps both your council and your employees continually move forward. So if we had gone through very large initiatives, you might have needed a year, the next year that was maybe some smaller ones to help everybody sort of catch up to that and get sort of that momentum again. But most of the ideas came from a bit of a gap analysis and both our managers, our directors, and our employees coming forward every year with ideas. Each one of our 21, 22 business centers would need to come forward and say, here's what we'd like to do for continuous improvement. So when it's coming from that bottom up, that's a way of sustaining it. If Rick and I had left, it wouldn't have mattered. That culture was still there. So that desire for continuous improvement and wanting to work for an organization that's striving for improvement and to be better is important to all.
Yeah, I'm sure that.
Oftentimes, too, the organization and the folks are thinking, this is my area and this is my responsibility, and oftentimes don't have necessarily an appreciation for the complexity and the interrelationships with other divisions within your organization. And so things like a systems and process review, we did a lot of those. I had no idea personally how complex the process was for the cemetery program and the burial process and the complexities and the interrelationships with other components within the organization, and going through and laying out all of those different factors, and the joint collective realization of the intricacies, the interdependencies, and the complexities allowed everybody to really help to streamline that and other processes.
Mm-hmm. That was a great example. And it jogged a memory of mine about how proud then those employees who were working with the cemetery felt about doing those processes and that, because people were understanding and appreciative of it. And they would make comments like, wow, I didn't realize that you did that, and what a sensitive area to work in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great example. And, just leading back to what you said about building that culture and inspiring, allowing people to be involved, and how much more engaging that is for the whole staff. And Rick, what you said is really about breaking down those silos that often will establish if not cared for, right?
Yeah, precisely.
Absolutely. That was always one of our side goals, was breaking down the silos. So many of the processes that they picked or we suggested potentially every year were mainly cross-functional processes, because those had the biggest value in terms of your culture and your outcomes in streamlining and in cooperation and in rejuvenating that process.
Absolutely.
Modernizing, maybe the better word, modernizing the process that time.
Mm-hmm.
So you were both involved with the Town of Okotoks for a lengthy period of time, would have seen multiple councils and different members coming and going. How can a municipality maintain momentum in continuous improvement efforts when you have that potential turnover of elected officials every 4 years? Often, and maybe not a whole council turns over, but even if there's a significant number, that strategic direction can really change. So how do you keep things going?
Well, there were certainly, it used to be every 3 years before it became every 4 years here in Alberta. First of all, a foundational respect for the fact that these new elected officials have their perspectives and their priorities. And our job as an administration was to sit down with them and collectively review and understand what their priorities were. And again, That has to be the collective will of council, not an individual. And then within that, work through those processes and help them to understand what we are doing right now. Things like customer service feedback was the best tool that we had to help them appreciate how we were going about the delivery of the businesses and areas where we needed to work on improvement. So, every 4 years, it was a new group of people. Sometimes it was an evolution. Occasionally, and we had a few back in the 80s where it was more of a revolution. And every community goes through that, and lots of communities have and will continue with every cycle. And as administration, we need to bring them back to the foundational aspect. Here's why we're here. Here's our purpose. Here's our raison d'etre. How do we now go about ensuring that we continue to provide the services that our citizens want and collectively address your priorities as elected officials?
I imagine having that framework in place would help establish that foundation and give that kind of guiding document to help keep everyone on the same track.
Yeah, some of our alignment was important. So it started with the council. They would do a 3-year plan or a 4-year plan, depending on their term, that was approved. That would be rolled out right through the organization, so they're all contributing. And they also were involved in our values. So there was early presentations. We have extensive council orientation. And the nice thing was is when there was returning councillors, they would also be helping each other understand, so that they would understand, what's happened in the past through the reports and whatnot on successes and areas for improvement. So, then we were really trying to continually align with what they wanted to do, with what some of the needs in the organization were as well, and then break that down and continue to work on it every couple of years. And there's a lot of satisfaction in being able to talk about successes.
Exactly. So I imagine, since you were so successful with this, that there were champions. Maybe the two of you were champions of these excellence initiatives and efforts. How did that work? Or did you have other key staff members that ended up being champions in some cases? Can you talk about that a little bit?
From a senior administrative point of view, my responsibility and that of the senior leadership was to be enablers of champions. It wasn't to be the champions, it was to enable champions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So over the years, depending on our size and what we were doing, we tried a number of different methods. And I guess I'm a believer that there's not one right answer in this one. There's no doubt that there were a couple of individual champions that were really driving it. But at one time we had an employee group that were the champions. There was one from each one of the larger departments that came forward, and we would meet and talk about it and what did we have to do, and they would bring information from the employees. That was in those earlier days. Later on, of course, it did become part of the director's responsibility, and what we call the business center manager, the department managers as well. They had responsibilities. So really what Rick's speaking to is obviously the ultimate with the CAO, but spreading it. And the more that you spread, the more success that you've had. And a number of people would come forward, like those people who were like-minded, that they were really excited about, being able to work on a different committee, work with different people, learn more about continuous improvement, and bring feedback from their colleagues. Those became the champions. There's a lot of natural ones that just come forward. I would say a little less success sometimes when they were appointed. Tried that a little bit.
Yep.
Sometimes it worked, but not always. They maybe didn't have the passion at times.
I think the other thing is within an organization, the culture. Our culture was one of, this isn't a flavor of the week. This is a core essential of this organization and this community. So don't be thinking it's just something that you can dismiss after the meeting's over, because that's not how it works. We were very much committed to this ongoing, continuous refinement over time.
Yeah, and I think I I don't remember now whether I mentioned values. We had corporate values, and within those corporate values, it might have been called different things over the years because we would renew those with the employees, but one was always about organizational excellence. So even from when you were being hired, you were being told, this is who we are, and who we plan to continue to be. And in council's business plan or strategic plan, depending on the year and what they were calling it, we also always had a major goal that was along those lines too. That somehow that we had to demonstrate to them that we were doing the right things. Basically, we were always continuing improving. So I think that was important in building that culture and having it continue to live regardless of who was driving it.
Well, it sounds like a contagious kind of occurrence. Once you get started, it might take some time, but once people get into it and learn more, then they become more interested and willing to put the effort in from their perspectives. Yeah,
that's a great comment because we definitely had, depending on where they were at, some that were just solely interested in, say, that process or the initiative that they were working on. We had others that really wanted to know far more about what the overall program was and not just from where their own perspective was. One way that we did this that I'll mention, we had started to do an employee gathering every year, and they had to present. They had to pick one person from each one of the departments, if you will, that would mention what the success was that year, and they were limited to 3, so it was always challenging. And then they would talk about what 3 goals they had the next year for continuous improvement. And the director or the manager were not the ones that were presenting that. That needed to be the employees. So I have to say, that was another way you could align it. Just one small example, where you were getting engagement at those front levels, not solely at the management team.
What a great way to bring everybody into it and really find those people that want to get involved and be a part of those movements. You kind of, sorry, Rick, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it's a culture of innovation when it's enshrined and when people appreciate that it truly is part of the core business. They then become motivated, and when they go to conferences, their motivation is to find out, for example, what other communities are doing, what they're doing best, what challenges and issues they have. And then they become our teachers when they come back as to what sort of refinement to our processes and initiatives we ought to consider.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And I'm sure that Town of Okotoks was often the leaders of some of that at conferences with the great work that you did. Speaking of that, can you share some of the examples of your successful excellence initiatives? You've already shared a few, but are there any other key ones that you want to share?
We talked a little bit about processes. We did spend a fair amount of time on process mapping for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was, of course, like any municipality, when you're looking at your demographics and you were starting to say, okay, whether people are retiring or at some point they've moved to a different area, we actually don't. Everything's in our head, and we've got to get that down on paper. So that was a very successful initiative, and most of those were cross-functional. One example specifically, we had most communities do kind of a community program and leisure guide that they produce a couple times a year. That group was probably about a total of about 20 people that contributed to that. And getting them into a room to say, here's our current process, here's our dream process, what do we need to do? They cut out 4 full days of production within that. And at least the time I was there, they never missed another deadline. And there used to be deadlines and missed all the time because they didn't understand why there were certain deadlines. And so that was a really positive initiative, would be one that comes to mind. Another one we talked about was development in development services. Most communities, most municipalities really have challenges between those that are developing, going for permits, etc. They think the process is complicated and long, and sometimes it is. So that was another very, very successful. At one time, we decided to step out of the box from doing the internal and actually started to invite the developers. There was one an offsite levy, and as well as the development community. So that was very interesting that we thought we really stepped out of our comfort zone when we're talking about this process mapping. And the other one that comes to mind is around partnerships. When we got looking at a model, and one of the models was about how are you working with your supplier and your partner? That's something Okotok had never focused on particularly. And so we did. We looked at who are our largest partners and what's their opinion of our processes and our customer service and how we're working together. And that shed some light in a different way of a couple of things that we were doing right and a couple of things that we could really improve. Those two that come to mind.
And you can't be shy about seeking out feedback. You can't be shy about that. You need it. That's how you get better. That's how you do things.
That's a real sign of maturity in an organization, I think, is when they're willing to, like Nancy suggested, step outside the comfort zone and the box that we all find ourselves in sometimes, and look from a different perspective. And then also, Rick, like what you have said in being willing to ask for that feedback and do something about it. I think that really shows a high performing organization, because you're willing to look everywhere for things that you can do better.
Well, and for example, collaborating with the development industry and growth management was a huge focus for the 27 years I was in it. And sitting down with our development community and saying, here's the legislative framework under which we charge developers for contributions to infrastructure and roads, etc. And here's some of the challenges and the issues we face. And here's the criteria we use for determining cost sharing. Help us to go through and help us to prioritize what you believe from your perspective are the important infrastructure issues the community needs to deal with pronto and into the future. That was a great exercise because it created an awareness and understanding by them of the complexities of managing growth in a community, and that it wasn't all about their little neck of the woods. It was a much broader perspective that impacted their neck of the woods directly.
Yeah, and when we think about, we don't often think about competitiveness with municipalities, but a municipality that, like yours, that's willing to bring the developers in and collaborate with them is going to be a lot more attractive to that developer than a community that, or a municipality that just kind of drives the process and doesn't really seem to care what the other developers think or have to contribute, right?
Certainly have seen that in other communities, definitely.
So are there strategies that you have for convincing, maybe you didn't have to, but maybe you can think of strategies for convincing elected officials to engage in excellence initiatives and invest in that sort of activity?
Good question. It came from a number of different areas, like we mentioned earlier, around the alignment. So when you're doing your council orientation, you're looking at your values, you're looking at past business plans and what you've accomplished. They're already being exposed somewhat to that. With budgets, I would say, sort of back in the really early days when we were very small, it doesn't need to cost a lot of money. There's no doubt that there's money being spent, so to speak, when your employees are participating in a workshop and they're being trained. Most municipalities have budgets either way. So it's a matter of you either have a corporate budget for it, as an example, or if you're needing to do some training, perhaps you're taking it from some of those training budgets as well. So we didn't have huge challenges, although I would say that once we were fortunate to have a champion from private industry on our council who was very supportive of the continuous improvement initiative that we were going through. And that certainly was very helpful because this individual happened to understand it far more than the rest of them did. So I guess my advice there is to say, again, start from where you're at. And it's not so much that you're going to council, at least luckily in our case, and asking for specific dollars. It really was about utilizing some of those budgets that were already there to do what we needed to do.
Yeah, like a lot of
And at
the
end of day-
initiatives really take labor, time, right? And so if you can get all of your team members working in that manner with continuous improvement and embracing that, you've got that many staff working just naturally at it, right? There doesn't have to be specific funding that goes towards some of these efforts. Rick, I interrupted you. What were you about to say?
I lost that thought, but I had another one. The thing I was just going to mention is that there also needs to be, in order for this to be successful and ongoing and have legs, there needs to be a proper staff recognition. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't just include compensation. Mm-hmm. That includes a lot more. And providing that kind of, providing forums in which, first of all, people could proudly boast about their accomplishments, and then receiving recognition from the community, from their peers, from their associate organizations, from the citizens at large. That was very beneficial in helping folks move forward and maintain momentum and energy. Mm-hmm.
So regionalization is another hot topic with the municipal sector these days, and has been for a while, and maybe hasn't progressed as fast as would be beneficial overall. But obviously there's opportunities to increase efficiency and reduce overall costs for a region, and that contributes to higher performance and excellence. What do you, having all of your wisdom and past experience, what do you think are the key areas that municipalities could focus on with respect to regionalization, or even any alternatives to regionalization that would be the most beneficial overall?
Regional collaboration is critical. Has to be senior government policy leadership to make that happen. And in Alberta, we've gone through different cycles of senior government leadership and or intervention as it relates to regional collaboration and partnership. So there needs to be leadership from provincial government, for municipalities to move forward in regional collaboration and regionalization initiatives. But then there needs to be a desire and an awareness and an understanding that there are tremendous benefits when it comes to collaborating on a regional level around the delivery of services. And that's something that we focus on. We don't have regional governments here in Alberta. We used to have a regional planning commission system. We now have a different planning framework that the Alberta government has brought forward. But within it, there is a fundamental understanding that there are certain things that are common and in our collective interest as a region to work together on. And there are certain things that each community feels are of their own wish and domain, and they work forward accordingly. We've had some fantastic intermunicipal, I'll call them, as opposed to regional, intermunicipal initiatives around development of recreation complexes, around delivery of services, and around utility infrastructure, especially with many of the water supply challenges we're facing here in Alberta. And more recently, this community has begun to assist other smaller communities within our area to provide for services such as solid waste collection. So there are opportunities for it to occur. There just needs to be a mindset and a framework that invites opportunity.
Yeah, and I'm thinking way back in the day, it was motivational at times too. Sometimes when there's a need, with our boom and bust type of a province that we do have, when there was threats, there's no doubt that those employees were super engaged. We were all looking for what can we do to save money? How can we change that process? Those types of things. And at one time when regionalization was seen as a bit of a threat, let's say, to some of them, I remember one department in particular, they sat down and said, okay, how do we be the best that we can be? So that, in fact, if there's going to be anything like that, maybe we're taking them over, or we're just simply not going to be able to. And that's not just regionalization, but that's also like contracting out. So they decided that they would change their hours. They made a lot of different decisions themselves, the employees, and made those suggestions to their managers, etc., and then implemented them because they were all approved and saying that's great. So there again, you can see it as a threat, or you can say, again, if we're the best at what we're going to do, maybe we're the ones, which is came true in the waste example that you gave. That was many years of lots of improvement and contracting out. We did contract out for a while there as well.
Lots of opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just like you said, you just sometimes there's drivers that force you or urge you to make different decisions, and having all that information that you gather through some of these excellence initiatives, I'm sure is helpful in determining where the opportunities or gaps are that you can work with others collaboratively on.
Yeah, and you do it respectfully. It's not a stick. It's like you think about your own family budget, right? Okay, so there's a lot of inflation these days, and we're having to cut back. What can we cut back on? Right? That's not that dire threat of the big stick. It's really about how can we all work together, so that we can still do the things that are really important to us, and we can cut back in some areas that aren't. It's kind of that same philosophy. I think that's important again about respecting those employees and their ideas. And it's amazing how every single job knows some way that they can improve. And improving isn't always cutting back. Sometimes it's also about spending more.
Yeah, that's so true. So that's some really great advice that you have shared, both of you, today. I have one last question for each of you, and that is, how do you remain in the growth zone? What do you do to maintain or deepen your growth mindset?
I guess for me, that's a bit of an easy answer because I think it was just ingrained for so long. I love learning. And so, even being retired now, you're constantly, looking and wanting to hear about, different things or improvement and whatnot, and challenging yourself around, maybe that's the way I thought, for the last 10 years, but the world's changing. And so maybe I need to adapt and constantly look for, sort of adapting to that new world, but not losing the core values that you have.
Awesome.
I think physical and mental well-being is critical as well. And so lots of kayaking and golfing and hiking, and camping and skiing.
Yeah.
And doing all those things, as I mentioned to you earlier, when you get to retirement, there are only 2 days in the week, weekdays and weekends.
Yes, for sure.
We do our chores on the weekends.
Nice. That's a great way to spend your life in retirement, I think. The opposite of the work week. But mind you, you probably had a 7-day work week.
Yeah. Municipal government is definitely a demanding career.
Yeah. And it has its upsides and its downsides. And you need some thick skin every once in a while to get through things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today and share your wisdom and advice across the municipal community and others out there. Some of these concepts apply across all organizations, but I really appreciate you contributing this way.
Great. Thanks a lot. And just last words to anybody that's listening. It's doable and it's scalable. Go for it.
Awesome.
Thank you, Tracey, for this opportunity. Best wishes.
Thank you. See you again.